by the way, for legal reasons. No, I'm not accusing Murray Gold of doing a load of coke.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another WhoCulture discussion with Seán and Ellie. We're back. Woo!
Thanks for having me.
I was holding in a choke that whole time. We have seen a bit of a debate going on within the fandom lately, and we've kind of had this discussion amongst ourselves as well. But given the kind of muddle that Doctor Who is in at the moment, it is a serious conversation to be had, I think, about whether or not Doctor Who needs a full reboot. Would that be the best course of action for Doctor Who moving forward, considering all of the kind of uncertainty and mess and blur that's happening at the moment? I think there's genuine argument on both sides for this, but we thought, you know what? Seeing as everyone else seems to be discussing it, we'll discuss it too.
We love a good bandwagon.
Of course we do. First of all, it kind of depends on what you determine as a reboot.
See, that was when we first were talking about this, and we were like, okay, reboot. I was like, well, every time we regenerate, we more or less reboot. But then I had to think and went, well, maybe that's not entirely true. Like, Eccleston into Tennant wasn't a reboot. Where I would say Tennant into Matt Smith was a reboot, because everything changed. Showrunner changed, the way the show was made changed. Even though the composer stayed on, he took a boatload of cocaine, and then, the music changed, by the way, for legal reasons. No, I'm not accusing Murray Gold of doing a load of coke. But, the entire format really changed. We've talked about this on the channel before, where it went from the crash bang wallop of Russell T Davies to the fairy tale of Stephen Moffat. And then I would say, yeah, more so Capaldi into Jodie was another kind of soft reboot. I think Capaldi was because of season 7, Capaldi was sort of a natural progression of where that era was going. And then yeah, going into Jodie was a reboot. So, and as was Jodie into 14. Sort of 14 into Shooty, but then 14's era was so short.
Yeah. Oh, it's still so sad. It's too fresh.
Oh my goodness, yeah. I vividly remember, like, not that long ago, because it wasn't that long ago, but like the whole year where we were going, oh my God, what's the 60th going to be like? What's the 60th going to be like? And then it was gone.
Yeah.
Was like, wait, what?
I'm getting all excited for Shooty to be the Doctor, and now he's not the Doctor anymore.
Right?
What's going on? Yeah, for me, when I think reboot, I think 2005 revival. That to me is the big reboot. I guess, yeah, maybe going into Matt Smith was a reboot of sorts, but it kind of was and wasn't, in as much as, the themes were still there and there was crossover in storylines and things. I would say that once we got to the Chibnall era, that was more of a reboot. And they'd made no secret of the fact that they kind of wanted that to be the case. Most of the stories were very separate from anything that came before. You didn't have episodes that suddenly linked back to a previous series. You also kind of changed the setting as well. Like, everything up till then was kind of set in modern day London. That's where most of the companions came from. And for the Chibnall era, it kind of shifted, and there was kind of changes in that regard. But then, when you get to like season one, the Ncuti Gatwa era, I think that the thing with that is that they framed it as a reboot. They framed it as, this is a jumping on point for new viewers. And then very much did the complete opposite of what I feel a reboot is.
Oh my goodness. It's like, hey, I hope you're up to date on Classic Who, which I do want to talk about Classic Who again as part of this conversation. But this really like Ncuti first season, I guess, spoiler alert, Sutek, who had never been mentioned from Paul McGann right up to Ncuti. Excuse me, what have you passed on to us? And yes, of course, Gabriel Wolf was in the Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit, which was amazing. So I remember watching those at the time and the conversation around Sutek. But oh my goodness, like this. And also, because of the Tales of the TARDIS, and not everybody watches Tales of the TARDIS because they're like iPlayer exclusive. But that was kind of like, we're going to drop this episode in to be like, hey, watch Pyramids of Mars, because otherwise you won't get the episode. That's not a reboot.
No. And I think that's the kind of difference, because, I'm very conflicted as an existing viewer. I love it when everything connects together and it all links to things of the past. But I think when you advertise a season as a reboot, and then I mean, even I as an existing viewer, but mostly of the modern era, even I had to kind of research, well, who is Sutek and who is Omega and who is the Rani? These characters who, even if you are someone who's watched since 2005, you're not necessarily familiar with. I think the trouble with that is that there's a balance that needs to be met in terms of where they go forward. I think 2005 is, like I said, the prime example of how to do it well.
So, okay, I'm gonna just because this is a really good point. Ellie, what is a reboot to you? What do you think constitutes a reboot?
I think changing things up for a start. I think changing the showrunner, changing the direction of the stories. I think the focus should always be on telling new stories. And I think maybe a lot of the newer stuff has got bogged down with trying to connect everything together. And I don't think that needs to be the focus. Like, if you look at 2005, we had a new Doctor. We'd introduced an entire new backstory to the character that we hadn't heard of in the classic era. And it didn't undermine the classic era because there'd been this big gap. So you could understand or believe that something had happened in this time that we hadn't been with the character. But for the most part, the stories were new, the characters were new. But then you had the Daleks return. And there's your connection to the past. So I think it doesn't need to completely ignore everything that came before, which I think maybe is where the Chibnall era suffered, because I think the first series of the era tried to completely distance itself from anything that came before. Then they maybe realized that's maybe not the best approach, and you do need something that connects it to everything else. And then we had the return of the Daleks, and then we saw the Sontarans come back, and gradually we had the Master and the Sea Devils. And I think it needs to be a balance of maybe 70% new stuff, and then 30% keeping it connected to everything that came before, but not to a point where you've isolated most of your audience, even the existing viewers who don't know what's going on.
It's I'm pretty much on the same page for everything you're saying there. I think to have enough tying it so it's not just a new show with the same name, basically. Like I think of, excuse me, I think of things like, if we think comic books, particularly the DC movie universe recently, which is, I mean, Blink and there's a reboot, but you always know who Batman is. You know who the Joker is, like, even if it's a new interpretation or a new this, what, and that. So, like, that's a property that gets rebooted again and again and again. So, obviously, we were not around, much as people have, insinuated I'm old enough to be, we were not around when Hartnell regenerated into Patrick Troughton, which is probably the most seismic shift in the Doctor Who universe, because suddenly the Doctor was a new man. And that itself, obviously I'm looking at it from a more contemporary lens, but that itself I would not class as a reboot, whereas I do think Troughton into Pertwee, there was so many changes going on in the show and outside of the show. I mean, not least the transition from black and white to color. And it's not just that Pertwee's Doctor is very different from the two that came before, but the way that they told the show, he was mostly based on Earth, for example. Still very much Doctor Who, still very much in that same universe, but you could be accused of, or you could accuse the show of in name only. That's not to say that it's bad, but I'm used to a man with companions zipping around time and space in the TARDIS, and Pertwee wasn't doing that. Instead of the TARDIS, we had Betsy. Do you know what I mean? And then that changes again, because then you have Tom Baker, and so on and so on. Like, Doctor Who is one of the shows that lends itself both to change so well, thanks to that initial decision, and also makes it hard to fall under complete reboot definition, however we define it, because it includes the regeneration every few years. So how do you reboot something that has changed so baked into the DNA of the show, which I do agree has ironically led to a bit of staleness? Maybe relying on the fact that we can just swap out the actors and going, great, now we can do the same thing again, which again, they did very successfully with David Tennant, because partly Eccleston only had that one season. still the same sets. Jackie Tyler was back, Rose Tyler was back. It was the same show with a different actor. It went very well there. Maybe not so much in some of the years since. I know you hate Peter Capaldi, and everyone who was involved in Peter Capaldi's seat. I'm of course kidding. But some of the fatigue, as wonderful as, and I think 12 has aged very well, there was a slight bit of fatigue creeping in, I think, coming in around there. And that was because, sorry for repeating myself, but because of season 7 and all of the changes that went on there, Capaldi just effectively stepped onto Matt Smith's TARDIS,
Yeah.
And I think continued to pace from there. And there were teething problems, as there always are with every new Doctor. And I feel it took into season 9 for that to settle a little bit again. Perhaps the show could have done with more of a reboot. Keep the actors, keep everything, but just a more of a shake-up. Now
that you've said that, because I think actually if I was going to consider things like that in terms of a reboot, I think when you really start to see that shift and a change for Capaldi's Doctor is once you get to series 10 and you have Bill.
You just hate Clara.
But it's interesting, though, that you have the crossover of companions means that it doesn't feel like anything's changed because the Doctor might have changed, but the companions haven't. But not only that, you then had the Doctor in a different environment because he was working as a professor in this university. And as you say, changing things up so that the Doctor's in a different situation and scenario, I think is really interesting. And I'm actually would be quite interested to see if they, in whatever iteration they go with next, for them to change things up a little bit. Obviously, as you say, in 60 years of the show, it's hard to think of new things to do with the character. But you're right, having the third Doctor stuck on Earth changed things up in a way that meant you weren't just watching a rehash of the same format with a new actor in the position of the Doctor. So I think that would be quite interesting. And then for all of the criticism it might get for various reasons, Trial of a Time Lord is another situation where they change things up a little bit.
Good shout.
Because you had, limited resources and various constraints on there, but it meant that you had to look at it from a different angle and see this character from a different light and not have the same format that you're used to seeing. So I think that could be quite interesting. And again, for Flux. Flux was a very serialized story that we're not used to seeing in Doctor Who. And again, it had its flaws. You've got to find the right way of doing it. And a lot of people don't like change, and maybe some people wouldn't like it. But I do think for a reboot, you need to change things up. And I think that's why 2005 worked so well, because there'd been such a big gap that without really needing to change much in terms of the format, everything had changed. The look of it had changed. The budget had grown compared to what we'd seen before. I don't want the budget to get too high because then we fall into the issues we were having more recently. But the budget of 2005 was definitely higher than that of the 80s.
I'll give it no, because there's a funny meme floating around, and it's Nessa from Gavin and Stacey, and it's like so someone comes up and says, "I'm presenting my idea for Doctor Who Series 1. Can you approve the budget?" She goes, "All right, fair enough, 50 quid." And I mean, but they made it work. Now we've talked about this a lot. Like the Mill did incredible work when you think about. I mean, not only it was 2005, so technology was what it was, but also television budget.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Though I think for that, the reason that was so successful is you'd had this long gap, and things had actually changed a lot in that period of time. So that when it came, it felt new and refreshed and different without needing to change too much. But unfortunately now, you've got to do more to make it different and stand out. I think the last 2 seasons have proven that just throwing more money at it doesn't necessarily make it better.
No.
You've got to change up more than just how much money you have with it. Look at the stories, look at the characters, look at the setting. I think a different setting could be very interesting, either, like you say, trapping the Doctor into one place or exploring a different planet for an extended period of time, or, just changing things up slightly so that it's the same but different. It's still got those core elements, but it's not just a rehash.
One of the... Because again, how do you define a reboot? But one of the clearest reboots that's ever happened happened in the 60s, and it was Peter Cushing's movies, because that was the Doctor, or Doctor Who, which still sets people's teeth on edge. And you had Ian and Barbara, and you had Susan, and it was all same but not. You know, you had the Daleks were in it, and it was, for all intents and purposes, it was just Doctor Who goes to the movies. You know, and we're not. It's not an episode. It doesn't fit in anywhere. It's a new thing. In the same way that, I suppose, to sort of use the DC example, Matt Reeves' The Batman is not a sequel to Batman Returns. You know, it's not like, you know, things like that. Not same universe, same characters, different universes. So that is an example of an actual, I guess, reboot in Doctor Who's history. Whereas even if you go forward, then the TV movie with Paul McGann technically isn't, because that leads on from Sylvester McCoy. And similar to Rose, stuff has clearly happened in the meantime between Sylvester McCoy's final appearance with Ace, with Sophie Aldred, Ace is the character, Sean, and then his appearance in the beginning of the Doctor Who movie. So it's, so less of a reboot per se. This is the struggle with Doctor Who, because Doctor Who just recasts the character. And I think now to do a reboot, to say go back to this is Doctor number 1, which I don't think will happen, but like to go back to Doctor number 1, I think you would end up alienating your core audience. Here's a question. Do you think a brand new day one, not connected to anything, Doctor Who movie, for example, would put bums on seats?
See, this is where my issue lies, because I think a reboot doesn't necessarily mean scrap everything.
Mm.
And I think a lot of fans who were going to watch a Doctor Who film now would have expectations of certain things that it would contain. And that's why, as I'm just repeating myself again, but for 2005, the thing that worked is that the core elements were there. You had the TARDIS, you had the sonic screwdriver, you had the Daleks, and everything else was different. But the core elements of Doctor Who were still present. The whole series does it well. You know, you've got absolute banger episodes like The Empty Child and the Doctor Dances. Entirely new concepts there. There's nothing in there that's from the past of Doctor Who. But then you've got the episode Dalek, which has an entirely new premise in involving the Daleks. You're exploring Daleks from a different perspective, but you've also got this very iconic alien in there, this very iconic element of Doctor Who in there. I think maybe things like the Slovene don't age so well, but even then, you know, it's it's difficult because obviously, I mean, I grew up watching those episodes. So for me, there's always those rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia. But I do feel like that era of the show did find that balance well. They didn't get too bogged down with making all these connections. They just kind of came naturally. They came up every now and then. You know, they held off on the Master until series 3. But then, you know, the Daleks were there, but they weren't the big bad of the series. But you had the Master there. But then they also introduced so many other great monsters as well throughout those series. You know, things like the Weeping Angels that now have become iconic, but at the time were a brand new invention. And I think they should always be striving to introduce the next thing that's going to be the icon. Whereas I think recently they got bogged down with trying to just bring things back.
That to me is crucial. So we are currently, as you know, we are in an era where nostalgia is driving creativity. And I think it is hurting so many different, and this is not related just to Doctor Who or even, you know, of Star Trek. You know, it's not just about one or two things. It's it's where we will concentrate on. Okay, here's how I define it. It's not about finding a new way to tell an old story. It's about reminding you the old story exists.
Mm-hmm.
That I thought was just baked into the Sutek storyline of season 1. And I mean, I would say the Rani was a little bit better. Because that was less sort of, you remember time in the Rani? You know, there was less of that. Whereas with Sutek, as I say, the Tells the TARDIS episode, they literally went, watch Pyramids of Mars.
Yeah, and then in the episode, they literally had the episode playing on a television screen so they could watch to see what was going on.
and I mean, Omega was so inconsequential that it didn't really matter if you'd seen the Three Doctors or not. But anyway, and that's I think it's how it's on. See, and that. So I'm going to use Suit. All right, I'm going to steady on Sutek as the example of that was an example of nostalgia for rib poking sense. And the problem that you run into with that is you are reminding your audience that somebody else told a story. You're not engaging them with your own story. And as I say, Doctor Who is by no means the only property that's ever done that. So that would be, so my checklist now for a reboot would be, and I guess even if it's just another regeneration, but very much I think series 1, yes, it was series 1, Eccleston, right? I think that did it very well. Because there's things as well that on the flip side of what I was just saying, there are things that you just know. Everyone in the world has heard of Darth Vader. You know, I would say a sizable portion of the audience who engages in any sort of, certainly sci-fi, but just anything, because The Simpsons knows what a Dalek looks like. They might not know the name of it, but they know the pepper pots with the plungers. You know, that image is just baked into pop culture. So series 1 bringing Dalek back makes a lot of sense to me. And it does it, as you said, it does it in such a way where it doesn't rely on you having seen the stories. You just know they're bad guys. And then it gives you a new story to work on with that. Because, of course, the Time War happens in between McGann and Eccleston. And so what I think, and not that this is a criticism of season 1, but I think what season 1 sort of fell into doing was going... It did not really going far enough in creating its own identity within the overall universe of Doctor Who. Not that you needed to have a Dalek in it, not that you needed to have a Cyberman in it, but you know, not really crafting its own identity. And this is obviously something we've talked about on the channel a lot. There's many, 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 many reasons. So it's not at any one person's door, and it's not a terrible season. It's just, it would be a stumble out of the gate after. The 13th Doctor was a bit of a stumble out of the gate for that as well. At least, no, both of them visually straight away. I know I'm watching the kind of 14th, 15th Doctor's era. I know I'm watching the 13th Doctor's era. You know, like that straight away. 12 and 11, there's a bit of, after a certain amount of time, there's a bit of like, it's less certain which one I'm watching. Whereas Series 5 looks like Series 5. Anyway, sorry, not to rabbit on for too long. Where Eccleston's season completely seismically changed what Doctor Who was, while still retaining the ingredients of what Doctor Who was. Series 5 did it. Series 10 got close.
Yeah.
But I also don't think it was the purpose of Series 10. I just think it's almost accidentally got close in that changing out, you know, bringing Bill in. And we haven't really got that since. Or maybe we did with 13, and just whether we liked it or not.
Well, yeah, this is the thing. I think the Chibnall era tried to be a reboot. I feel like Series 5, it kind of happened naturally, as you say. They didn't say, right, we've got a new Doctor, it's a reboot. It wasn't. It was just the Doctor's regenerating and we happen to have a new showrunner. But by changing those things up, it naturally looked different. It became different stories were being told. Similarly, as you say, with Series 10, you changed up the scenario, the situation of the Doctor, which again made it different. Series 11, they made it really clear that they wanted it to be And almost by advertising the fact that it was supposed to be, you went in looking for all those changes and then maybe feeling like, was that successful? Or because you knew they were there or you were looking for them, they became too obvious rather than a natural change. I don't know. But it is interesting, like the ones where they just kind of accidentally did it, it worked really well. When they kind of shone a light on it, it became obvious.
I think so. And I think there's also, obviously our focus on this channel really has been the last 20 years, and we won't pretend that it hasn't been. But when you think of the switch between 5 and 6, there was, like any regeneration, there is a switch, but also everything about the character of the Doctor changed, and it pushed them too far, because I think Colin Baker's performance has aged quite well, but he tries to strangle Perry in the first few minutes of being alive. There's things like, maybe don't do that. And those are writing choices. And as you say, Trial of a Time Lord, which I think has aged very well. I think showed every single era of Doctor is distinct in its own way. Maybe, poor old Troughton and Hartnell, because they're locked into the 60s, that aesthetic, and it's, it's black and white, and they do tend to get kind of, as different as they are, and they are very different, they do tend to get kind of like, there's the first and second Doctor, and also they're the ones with the most missing episodes. And then you have things like the fourth Doctor, who's still, he is still the longest serving Doctor, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Certainly isn't Shooty. But, everyone assumed crash positions, the timeless child. Things that change the fundamental understanding or perceived understanding of what the Doctor is, of what Doctor Who is as a property, what the history of the show is. Does that count as a reboot? Because reboot and retcon are different things.
Yeah.
Does that count as rebooting?
I don't think it counts as rebooting, but what I think would have been interesting is if something like The Timeless Child was a concept that they actually took and ran with. Because I'm saying that you should have changed things up, put the Doctor in different scenarios and situations. If they carried on with the Timeless Child arc beyond the regeneration, instead of just throwing the pocket watch into the TARDIS and ignoring all that information you spent a whole season looking for, that could have at least, it might have rubbed people up the wrong way. And I'm not saying necessarily that the story would have been great, but it is something that they introduced to be groundbreaking and change the history of the show to not really run with. And that could have been an interesting way to kind of reboot the show. Reboot it by jumping all the way back to Joe Martin and giving us a story that's pre all these other Doctors. That to me could have very easily been a reboot while still continuing a thread of the rest of the show. And it could have been a case of, you can either watch it from here and this is the adventures of Joe Martin, or as an existing fan, you now get to hear these stories that you know exist but have never seen.
That's actually something, that is something I love, the idea of having. Now, here's my little proviso. I love the idea of one Doctor before Hartnell. Have it be Joe Martin and set up why, or even recontextualize why the Doctor fled Gallifrey.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I am so on board for that. I have no problem with that. Make that's down to the writer, but make it make sense. Give us a reason. Years working for Division, cool with that. Carvanista, I love dogs, so yeah, cool with that. All of that, I'm totally on board with. I love that. It also gives you, actually, it sort of hands you your reboot card, because technically you can reboot by just setting up the old story. You can do that no problem, and have a first Doctor TARDIS look like whatever it looks like. That's fine. I do think, it was only recently somebody was talking, there's always somebody talking about the Timeless Child, but there was somebody saying recently about having the Doctor be where the Time Lords got the regenerations from. That is something you cannot just toss in like a match into a pile of gasoline and then just walk away. Because it's too interesting. It's too interesting a topic. Do that. If you're going to do it, do it. Excuse me. Sorry, I don't know what is going on with my hiccups and stuff today. I do apologize. Maybe this is it. Maybe this is all the various showrunners reaching through and going, "Stop him! Stop him!"
I do have a question then. So let's put all this aside and say, right, a reboot is happening.
Mm-hmm.
If a reboot is to happen, do you think that it would benefit from more of a gap, a longer wait? I think for me, I would say that it works best when maybe the rest of the show or what's come before isn't so fresh in the audience minds. And therefore, if you are rebooting and changing things slightly, it's easier to do that when people didn't watch the previous season a year ago and go, oh, but this is entirely different. I think, again, go back to the 2005 revival, that's maybe why that was such a success, because they'd had such a long wait that they almost forgot what had come before. And so when it came back, it was kind of like, oh, yeah, now I remember what that we used to be like, without going, oh, but at the end of that episode, this happened, and that hasn't continued on into this. Almost a case of kind of letting people miss it and then crave its return. Yeah, I think maybe that's where maybe the 2005 revival was really successful, but then maybe the Chibnall era wasn't, because they wanted this big reboot, but it immediately followed on from the Capaldi era.
Pretty much.
And so there wasn't enough time to kind of separate the two things in such a way.
I do not hate this idea. Obviously, I want Doctor Who on TV. I want new adventures. And maybe this is a way of having my cake and eating it. Is I like the idea to go back to day one. Go back to day one. Go back to, and I mean, hi, the Doctor. That's your name now. This is called a TARDIS. Tell that story because of two reasons. One is Joe Martin, please. But the also is that means you can both tell new stories. So all you need to do is, how many times have we heard years later about adventure? Oh, we just never saw it. Do you know what I mean? Like, so that's baked into Doctor Who. You can do that. You can have an ongoing series, but what you can also do is not worry at all about what's going on with Billie Piper. And not that I don't want Billie Piper, but you know what I mean? You can let that story settle and give somebody time, because with my hearts of hearts and with love, there is no plan.
They don't know what they're doing there.
Give them time to plan something with that.
This would be a good filler in the middle.
And like have it, even if it's a series spin-off, because again, I think whatever comes next, I think we're going to struggle if it's series season, if it's season 3. I don't know. I mean, maybe they are planning that. Maybe that will be that. But have, season 1 miniseries, Doctor Who and the TARDIS. Or a bit like those Peter Cushing movies, Doctor Who and the, use the camp kind of tie back to the 60s fun of it a little bit. Not that I feel you need to tie. I mean, the Peter Cushing ones, they're fine on their own. You don't need to tie them back. I loved the gag in the 50th anniversary, but like, that's fine. The dating controversy, that's fine. Have a bit of fun with that. But tell a story, tell it small scale, make it character based, because that's also where some of the best episodes of 15's run were character based, as we know. And some of the weaker ones were the ones that went, we're going to show you exactly what's in our CGI arsenal.
Yeah.
And they might look fantastic, but where's the story?
Yeah. Yeah. I think whatever happens, we're going to have a gap of at least a year and a half at the moment. It's kind of what you do with that gap. I think if they're going to go down the reboot route, then having that gap would be beneficial to separate what's coming next from what came before. If they're not going to do that and they're going to continue it, then if you haven't got something filling that gap, then there's such a thing as too long a wait between seasons before people just lose interest in what's going on. I mean, Danny's example here, and I do agree, is something like Stranger Things. There's been such a long wait between the last season and the new season that's coming that a lot of people have A, forgotten what happened, and B, kind of lost interest in the story.
Oh, I see what you mean. Sorry. Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah. And similarly, it's the same thing has happened recently with Star Trek. Through no fault of their own, strikes happened and various things happened that meant we had a cliffhanger at the end of season 2 of Strange New Worlds and then had to wait literally years
Yep.
before we found out what happened after that, the second part of that 2-part story. And it did get to a point where it was like, I've completely forgotten what happened in this previous story. So I think it hugely depends on whether we're going, if I think for me, if they're going for a reboot, a proper reboot, a gap is good. If they're going for season 3, continuing where exactly where it left off, then you either need something to fill that gap or it needs to be a not very long gap.
If you're doing a season 3, which I don't think they are, but if they're doing a season 3, that has to be next year for a couple of reasons. As you have said, like look at the amount of people that have sort of forgotten what's going on with Stranger Things. It happened with Star Trek. You're right. So, but what you're gonna do is you're gonna lose your passive audience. Because you and we're gonna watch every episode, hail, rain, or shine. And so will, I suspect. Let me know in the comments, but I suspect a large amount of the people watching this video are the people who are interested enough to show up after a gap. Where that's not as definite is when you have the people who might like to try the show out. Season 1 falsely advertised itself as a great jumping in place for new viewers. And in the modern age of everything is competition, because there is so much content. As quick as shows are greenlit, they're cancelled, sure, but there's a lot of competition out there for airtime, but also for headspace. I mean, you only have so much headspace to digest X amount of shows. Leaving it too long of a gap, you're going to lose your passive audience because they're going to watch something else. You're going to, the Taylor Sheridan universe is just everywhere, Yellowstone, which I haven't yet jumped onto, but I am told that I'm one of the 5 who hasn't. And then Star Trek, hopefully, yeah, please, lots more Star Trek. That would be fantastic. But also and as you mentioned as well, Star Wars, okay, Andor's come to an end, but there seems to be so much content all the time. And as overwhelming as that can be, I mean, I wouldn't know where to start when it comes to some of the Star Wars properties, but then there will be people who will watch that all the way through. It's brilliant. They're locked in. Doctor Who has been very fragmented. And because we're not dealing with just the BBC anymore, we're not dealing with, again, it's as much as it is, and we've talked about this, as much as it is a British institution, they took it worldwide, which puts it on a worldwide competition scale, which makes life a lot more difficult. Which is why there's a whole other conversations we can have, and I've touched on before about, can Doctor Who just go back to being a BBC show? Have they sort of gone, I don't think we can do that anymore. I don't know. I don't want to make any sweeping assumptions there because there's positives and negatives to everything. But yeah, a reboot, I think it is needed regardless, even if the reboot was Billy Piper in the TARDIS, right?
Yeah.
And even if that is a complete do like a whoops, we hit a graviton eddy and the TARDIS did its thing where it completely remodels everything, as they do every couple of years, so that you can go like, grand, cool, that's the on switch. We've left the parking brake. We can kind of exposition our way through for new viewers. And we haven't had a good, I don't know where this sentence started. We haven't had a good welcome new people moment in Who for so long.
Well, it's weird because we did have a bit of that at the beginning of season 1, where there were moments where he was explaining what the TARDIS was and all these things. And to an existing viewer, it was a bit like, oh, here's all the exposition for the new viewers. But then it so quickly fell into the complete opposite of that it was like, what is it they're trying to achieve here? You're explaining the simple things like what the TARDIS is, which I think most viewers can grasp. But then you have Sutek with zero explanation as to what he is or where he's from, or I don't know. It's all a little. Basically, what my takeaway here is that we need a reboot of sorts. Something needs to be changed up for the show to continue. But a lesson to be learned is to not do what you did for season 1.
I agree. Reboot and regeneration are not the same thing,
No.
as we've learned,
Yeah.
because Eccleston to Tennant was, I would say, is not a reboot.
No.
Tennant to Matt Smith was.
Mm.
Matt
It's funny
Smith-
because I hadn't considered that. I hadn't considered that to start with. To me, the reboot kind of was 2005 and then maybe Disney or Chibnall. But yeah, you're right. The reboot kind of came for Matt Smith, but as I said earlier, it kind of came as an accident. I don't necessarily think it needs a reboot, but it needs a revival. I think things need to be changed up. We need to maybe have some different stories going on, maybe different people in charge. There does need to be some changes made, for sure.
I agree. No, I agree. Revival, not reboot.
Yeah. It took us however long we've been talking to come to that conclusion. Conclusion is, do what you did in 2005 again.